On a crisp autumn morning in September 2014, the Bennett family set off for what should have been a simple weekend camping trip. John, the 42-year-old engineer, was well prepared, meticulously checking the maps, tent, and gear. Eileen, his 9-year-old wife, was more of a quiet observer of nature, enjoying the serene beauty of the world around her. Their 10-year-old daughter, Abby, full of youthful energy and excitement, couldn't wait to explore the trails. Together they ventured into the Great Smoky Mountains, a popular national park that draws millions of visitors every year. It seemed like a perfect day for a hike. But as the hours passed, something went terribly wrong. A single message from Eileen, "We're at the river, everything's fine, love you," was the last sign of life anyone would hear from them. The family simply vanished. No signs of a struggle, no abandoned backpacks, not a single trace of their journey. What happened to them? Was this just a case of getting lost, or something more sinister lurking in the woods? The disappearance of the Bennett family left an air of confusion and dread hanging over the Great Smoky Mountains. What began as a routine family hiking trip quickly spiraled into a mystery that would haunt the region for years. When Eileen's last text arrived, everything seemed normal. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on that Saturday evening, there were no more messages, no updates, no signs of life. By Sunday evening, concern began to set in. By Monday morning, it was no longer a case of a family simply taking longer than expected. They had vanished completely, and the clock was ticking. The National Park Rangers were the first to respond to the call, followed by a team of volunteers who scoured the popular Big Creek Trail where the family had been last seen. The area was dense with trees, and the scent of fresh autumn leaves filled the air. The temperature was dropping, and the forest had begun to take on its autumnal chill. The search parties combed through every inch of the path the family was known to have taken. They looked for anything: footprints, a dropped item, or even signs of an abandoned campsite. But there was nothing. Not a single sign of where the Bennett family had gone. It was as if they had evaporated into the very air they'd been breathing just hours before. Days turned into weeks, and the search grew increasingly frantic. Trained search dogs were brought in, their noses keen for any trace of human scent. They picked up the family's trail near the Big Creek, but shockingly, they lost it within 2 miles of the parking lot. The dogs were confused, almost as if the trail simply ended. The further they ventured into the woods, the more perplexing the situation became. The dogs would track the scent, but it would vanish just like that. No footprints, no discarded belongings, no sign of struggle. The forest had swallowed the family whole. With each passing day, the likelihood that this was a straightforward case of an accident or a mishap grew smaller. Yet, the authorities struggled to make sense of it. Were they lost? But why had they left no trace? Had they wandered off the trail and become disoriented? And if so, why were there no signs of an accident or any kind of emergency? No broken branches or tracks leading to water. No signs of panic. And the most puzzling clue of all, the Bennett family's car remained parked at the trailhead, untouched and undisturbed. It seemed almost impossible that they would have simply disappeared. They hadn't run off. They hadn't left in a hurry. They hadn't planned to go anywhere else. As investigators scoured the area, they considered other possibilities. Could the family have planned their disappearance? A troubling thought began to take root, but there was no evidence to support such a theory. The Bennetts had no known personal issues. John and Eileen were not facing financial ruin. Their bank accounts showed no unusual withdrawals, and there was no indication of any kind of impending crisis that might have prompted them to leave everything behind. There were no ransom demands, no messages suggesting they had been in danger. Everything seemed normal, until that final message from Eileen, sent at around 10 a.m. that Saturday morning. "We're at the river, everything's fine. Love you." It was a message filled with calm and comfort, and it was the last sign of life from the family. Could they have been the victims of foul play? The idea was terrifying, but as the days turned into weeks, there was no evidence to support that theory either. No one had seen anything suspicious on the trail. No strangers, no unusual vehicles, no evidence of any struggle. The family's personal belongings, backpacks, wallets, even their phones remained absent, and no one had any idea where they had gone. It was almost as if they had simply vanished into thin air. As time passed, the investigation began to stagnate. The initial search had mobilized hundreds of people, but there were no new leads. The search dogs had failed. There were no new eyewitness reports. And with each passing day, the likelihood of finding the family alive grew slimmer. The authorities began to scale down their efforts. The intense manhunt turned into something more subdued. Volunteers were sent home, and the search teams were reduced to a skeleton crew. The case was officially declared as missing, but with it came an air of frustration and growing hopelessness. For the Bennett family's loved ones, the uncertainty was unbearable. Sarah, Eileen's sister, remained adamant that something wasn't right. She couldn't accept that her family had just disappeared. The official word from the authorities was that there were no signs of foul play, no clues, and no further leads to pursue. Still, Sarah refused to let go. She organized search parties of her own, returning to the Great Smoky Mountains time after time, combing through the same areas, hoping for a breakthrough. But every time, it was the same nothing. The forest remained silent, and the family's disappearance became a local legend, a mystery no one could solve. It wasn't just the lack of clues that unsettled everyone involved, it was the eerie silence. A family, one moment hiking and enjoying the beauty of the mountains, and the next they had vanished without a trace. The woods had swallowed them whole, and no one could say why. It was as though the forest itself was hiding the answers. A case that had seemed like a straightforward search for a lost family was now something much darker. What had happened to the Bennetts? The mystery only deepened as the case grew colder. And for those who cared about them, the emptiness only seemed to grow with time. 9 years after the Bennett family mysteriously vanished from the trails of the Great Smoky Mountains, the answer to their disappearance finally emerged, hidden beneath the earth. It came not through another search or a sudden breakthrough in the investigation, but by sheer chance, a natural event, a violent storm that struck the region in May 2023. A powerful gust of wind, stronger than anything the forest had seen in years, uprooted an ancient oak tree, causing it to collapse into the ground with tremendous force. As the earth shifted and the tree's roots were torn free, something unsettling came into view, something that would change everything. A park ranger, conducting a routine assessment of the damage caused by the storm, stumbled upon the disturbing discovery. Initially, he thought it was nothing more than debris, old clothes, or refuse tangled in the roots of the massive oak. But as he approached the site and peered into the hole beneath the upturned roots, his blood ran cold. There, partially exposed, were human remains. His mind raced, and panic set in. This wasn't just a random finding, it couldn't be. And the more he uncovered, the more chilling the reality became. It wasn't just the discovery of the bodies that made the scene so disturbing, it was the way they were arranged. The 3 bodies, John, Eileen, and their 10-year-old daughter Abby, were positioned unnaturally close to each other, as if someone had placed them there with great care. Their limbs were bent at sharp angles, their bodies folded and contorted into the smallest possible space, as though they were being packed into a tiny, cramped space, almost like pieces of luggage shoved into a bag. It was a precise, methodical arrangement, suggesting that the person responsible had taken great effort in hiding them, concealing their true nature from the world. It was a gesture that felt eerily deliberate, calculated even. The forensic details of the scene grew even more unsettling as experts examined the area. Among the scattered remains, pieces of clothing were found, fragments of the synthetic materials that made up the Bennett's hiking gear. There was a small, faded patch of blue windbreaker, part of a children's boot, and bits of fleece, all preserved longer than the organic material. These were items the family had been wearing when they went missing all those years ago. But what was most chilling was what wasn't found: any signs of a struggle, no weapon, no remains of the family's backpacks or tents. Everything that would have been expected to accompany a camping trip, gone. The absence of these items raised troubling questions about what had really happened. Where had their gear gone? Why were the bodies carefully hidden beneath a tree? And who would have gone to such lengths? Forensic experts soon discovered something even more alarming. The injuries on the bodies were identical. Each victim, John, Eileen, and Abby, had a clear, singular, and very specific injury at the back of their heads. These weren't wounds from a fall, nor were they from a struggle or collision with rocks. No, these were deliberate, inflicted by something heavy, blunt, and with precise force, likely a rock or a tool specifically chosen for the job. The impact was concentrated, and the location of the injury, right at the back of the skull, indicated that each of the victims was struck from behind without warning. They hadn't even seen their attacker coming. The same method, the same position, these were not the random results of a tragic accident or the nature of a wild animal encounter. No, these were murders, planned and executed with chilling precision. As investigators pieced the evidence together, it became clear that this was no longer a case of a family lost in the woods. The story was no longer about people vanishing without a trace. This was now a triple homicide. The case, once a missing persons investigation, was reclassified. What had been a mystery for almost a decade now had the unmistakable marks of a calculated crime. The authorities, shaken by the brutality of the scene, began to approach the case with renewed urgency. They had been searching for the wrong thing all along. This was no random disappearance, it was a deliberate act of violence. The hunt for a killer, not a missing family, was now the primary focus. This was the turning point, the climax. What had once seemed like an unsolvable enigma, the inexplicable disappearance of a family, now had an answer, and it was a terrifying one. The eerie calm of the wilderness, which had once lulled investigators into believing that the Bennetts had simply lost their way, had given way to the shocking truth that someone had been lurking in those woods, someone with dark intentions. The mystery surrounding the Bennett family's disappearance had twisted into something far darker, far more sinister than anyone had imagined. As the investigation moved forward, questions lingered. Who was responsible for this horror? How had they carried out such a gruesome act without anyone noticing? And perhaps most haunting of all, who else could be out there? The discovery under the oak tree didn't just solve the case, it opened up an entirely new chapter of fear and suspicion. The forest had kept its secrets for so long, and now it was clear that it had been hiding something far more dangerous than anyone could have ever expected. The mystery was far from over. It was only just beginning. As the discovery of the Bennett family's remains sent shockwaves through the investigation, the question of who was responsible for such a brutal act began to consume the authorities. The forest, which had once been a peaceful sanctuary for hikers, now seemed to hold dark secrets. The unsettling way in which the bodies had been arranged beneath the roots of the uprooted oak tree, coupled with the identical injuries on each of the victims, suggested that whoever had done this wasn't just a random killer, they were methodical, almost clinical in their execution of the crime. But who could be capable of such a precise, cold-blooded act? The first breakthrough in the case came from the descriptions provided by tourists who had been hiking in the area around the time of the Bennett family's disappearance. Several individuals recalled seeing a lone man on the trail, someone who didn't quite fit the typical profile of a hiker. He was middle-aged, rugged, and had the kind of weathered appearance that suggested he spent more time in the wilderness than in the company of others. There was nothing particularly suspicious about him at first. He was simply another solitary figure in the vast landscape of the Smoky Mountains. But as the investigation dug deeper, this man became a crucial part of the puzzle. The descriptions were vague, but they were enough to form the basis of a new lead. One hiker remembered seeing the man near campsite 37, the same campsite the Bennetts had planned to stop at. He was sitting on a log by the river, staring out at the water, seemingly lost in thought. When a couple passed by and greeted him, he nodded, but didn't make eye contact. It seemed harmless at the time, just another lone traveler on his way, but now, with the benefit of hindsight, it appeared more suspicious. Could he have been stalking the family, waiting for the right moment to strike? The idea that he had been following them from a distance began to take shape. As investigators connected these dots, a startling connection emerged. The psychological profile of the suspect began to take form, and it painted a chilling picture. The man described by tourists wasn't just a random hiker. He was a vagrant, someone who lived on the fringes of society, moving from place to place without a permanent home. This was not someone who had a stable job or a family. He was an experienced hiker, perhaps even more so than many of the tourists who ventured into the wilderness. His lifestyle and skills in the outdoors suggested that he could survive in the wild for extended periods, living off whatever he could scavenge. What made him particularly dangerous was his target: tourists. He preyed on those who ventured into the park, equipped with expensive gear, hiking boots, backpacks, tents, all the supplies that someone living a transient lifestyle could use. He was not interested in killing for sport or out of some twisted desire for violence. No, his motives seemed clear: robbery. But the way he went about his crimes, carefully stalking, waiting for the perfect moment, and then striking with ruthless efficiency, showed a disturbing level of planning. He was not an impulsive killer. This was a man who had thought through every step of his actions, perhaps even rehearsed them in his mind. His victims were chosen for their vulnerability and their possessions, and he took whatever he could use. It was during this phase of the investigation that a key breakthrough came in the form of a cold case from another state. The disappearance of Mark Renshaw, a two-year-old student from Washington, had been eerily similar to that of the Bennetts. In 2018, Mark had gone on a solo hiking trip in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, also known for its rugged terrain and wild beauty. Like the Bennetts, he had been an experienced hiker, carrying high-quality camping equipment. He was last seen at the trailhead, and his car was found abandoned in the parking lot, just like the Bennett's vehicle. A search was launched, but it ended in frustration, with no trace of Mark or his belongings. His case, like that of the Bennetts, was eventually filed away as a missing persons report, with no leads and no answers. That was until the remains of Mark Renshaw were discovered a year later, hidden under a large rock, deep in the forest. He had been carefully concealed, his body covered with branches and stones. And just like the Bennetts, Mark had suffered the same fatal injury, a single, precise blow to the back of his head. His high-end gear was missing. The similarities between the two cases were too striking to ignore. It was then that investigators realized they were dealing with a serial killer, someone who had been operating in the shadows, targeting innocent hikers for years. The connections between the two cases were undeniable. The injuries were identical: an expertly delivered blow to the back of the head, likely dealt with a blunt object, perhaps even a tool that the killer kept on him. The absence of belongings in both cases pointed to a clear pattern of robbery, though the brutality of the murders suggested that the killer had no qualms about taking lives in cold blood. As detectives delved deeper into the case files, they realized that this wasn't just a random killer. This was someone who had targeted multiple victims, methodically carrying out his crimes in isolated areas, far from the prying eyes of civilization. The connections between the two cases painted a terrifying portrait of the killer, someone who was not just a desperate vagrant, but a cold and calculated predator. He had spent years operating under the radar, moving through the forests, preying on those who dared to venture into the wild. But now, with the discovery of the Bennett's remains and the new evidence linking him to Mark Renshaw, the authorities were beginning to close in. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the hunt for the killer had begun in earnest. This was no longer just a case of a missing family. It was a hunt for a serial killer who had left a trail of bodies in his wake. The truth was finally starting to emerge, and the implications were chilling. The investigation, which had been stagnating for years, finally took a dramatic turn. Just when it seemed as though the case would fade into the archives, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: surveillance footage. The detectives working on the Bennett case had been combing through all the leads and evidence for months, looking for anything that might point them in the right direction. It wasn't until they examined old security camera footage from a second-hand outdoor gear store in a small town near the Great Smoky Mountains that they discovered something chilling. The grainy footage showed a middle-aged man entering the shop with a large, used backpack and a camping tent. He was wearing simple, nondescript clothing, but what caught the store owner's attention was the quality of the equipment. It was high-end, expensive gear, exactly the kind of items the Bennetts had been carrying when they went missing. The store owner, who had recalled selling the gear for a mere fraction of its value, remembered the transaction, but never thought much of it at the time. The man had paid cash, said very little, and left quickly. It wasn't until the footage was reviewed, years later, that the man's face sparked a grim realization. The man in the footage was none other than Randall Clark, a name that would soon send a wave of terror through the investigation team. Clark, a vagrant with a history of petty crimes but no serious convictions, had been living under the radar for years. He had moved around the western United States, working seasonal jobs, but never staying in one place for too long. He was exactly the type of person investigators had been looking for, but until this moment, his name had never appeared on their radar. His connection to the murder of Mark Renshaw and now the Bennett family was finally confirmed. It was clear now. The man who had stalked and killed the Bennett family had been living among the very people he preyed upon: travelers, hikers, adventurers, looking for solace and nature, all while he waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. But even with the camera footage and a confirmed identity, there was still one thing left: a confession. Randall Clark had been living in the shadows for so long, but now, with the evidence mounting, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The arrest of Randall Clark was quiet, almost anticlimactic. When he was taken into custody, he showed no fear, no shock, just an eerie calm. When investigators sat him down for questioning, they were met with a chilling silence. For hours, Clark said nothing, staring blankly at the table, unwilling to speak. But detectives were patient. They didn't rush him. They let the silence build, knowing that this was a man who had been living in isolation for years. His defiance, his reluctance to speak, only confirmed what they had suspected, that he was a predator who had been hiding in plain sight. Finally, it was the details of the case that broke him. The investigators began to lay the facts out in front of him. The surveillance footage, the identical injuries on the victims, the missing gear, and the cold, methodical way in which the bodies had been hidden under the oak tree. It was as if, piece by piece, Clark could see his life's dark actions being exposed. And then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. His confession was delivered in the most matter-of-fact tone, almost devoid of emotion, as if he were recounting a mundane event rather than admitting to 3 brutal murders. Clark explained how he had carefully watched the Bennett family from a distance, stalking them along the trail. He recalled how he had waited for the perfect moment when they would be at their most vulnerable. John Bennett, the father, had gone down to the river, and Eileen and Abby were sitting on a blanket, relaxed and unsuspecting. It was then that Clark approached them from behind, silently, with a heavy stone in his hand, his weapon of choice. He struck John first, then Eileen. Abby, the child, had no time to scream. He told investigators it had all taken less than a minute. Once the family was dead, Clark dragged their bodies further into the forest, away from the trail, and hidden them beneath the roots of an old oak tree. The trees around them were quiet, as if the forest itself held its breath, while the bodies were placed with disturbing care. He folded them into unnatural positions, making sure to take up as little space as possible. He knew what he was doing. It wasn't just about killing them. It was about concealing their deaths in a way that would make the discovery as difficult as possible. After hiding the bodies, he took their belongings, everything they had with them, their backpacks, tents, sleeping bags, even their food. He had no intention of leaving them with anything. These were items he could use, items that would help him survive until they wore out. The chilling part of his confession was the casual nature in which he described his actions. For Clark, murder was a means to an end. It wasn't an act of rage, nor was it driven by any emotional need. It was a simple act of survival. The items he took from the Bennetts were just as much a part of his nomadic existence as the dirt on his boots. He used their equipment for months after their deaths, until it had worn out. Then he discarded it. But what he didn't count on was the fact that someone would eventually notice, and they did. Randall Clark's confession was more than just a criminal admittance. It was a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man who saw nothing wrong with what he had done. He was not a man driven by some deep psychological trauma. He was a man who saw people, vulnerable people like the Bennetts, as mere objects. His confession marked the end of a long and painful chapter for the Bennett family's loved ones. But it also raised new questions. How many other victims had there been? How many families had come into contact with this man unknowingly? With Randall Clark behind bars, the case was finally solved, but the fear it left behind was far from over. His story was one of survival, but not of the wilderness. His survival came at the expense of others. And for those who had lost family members to his hand, the truth was a far more terrifying revelation than anyone could have anticipated. The arrest of Randall Clark brought a sense of closure to the long-running mystery of the Bennett family's disappearance, but it was a bittersweet resolution. While the authorities could finally confirm the truth, and justice was served with Clark sentenced to life in prison, the toll it took on the family's loved ones was immeasurable. Sarah, Eileen's sister, and the rest of the Bennett family had endured nearly a decade of uncertainty and heartbreak, and though they now had answers, they could never undo the pain of losing their loved ones in such a brutal and senseless way. The forest that had once been a place of peace and adventure was now a dark symbol of the horror that can lie hidden in the most unexpected places. As we reflect on this chilling story, it serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most ordinary of people. Randall Clark's ability to blend into the background of society, moving from place to place, preying on unsuspecting victims, is a sobering thought. As unsettling as it may be, it's a reality we must face. Sometimes, the most dangerous predator in the forest is the one who looks exactly like you, someone who walks amongst us, unnoticed, until it's too late. Thank you for joining us in uncovering this harrowing story. If you found this case as gripping as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on future videos. There are more chilling stories, deep dives into true crime, and untold mysteries awaiting you. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest things are hidden in plain sight.